Hello, everyone. I believe that we are live now. My name is Karl Orzechowski, and I'm the content director for Faunalytics. If you are tuning into this Facebook Live, you probably know a little bit about Faunalytics already, but I would love to tell you a bit more about us and about myself. So I got my start in animal advocacy in 2005. That was the year I went vegan, and I also became the tech supervisor and co-producer for an animal rights radio show based in Toronto, Canada. Around 2010, I moved on from that and became a documentary filmmaker and got involved in animal rights investigations, working with a variety of groups around the world. And in 2012, I released a feature-length documentary about animals used in science and the effect that animal experimentation has on both animals and the people who experiment on them. I got involved with Faunalytics in 2014, and since then, I've been the content director for the organization. So part of my role is to help curate our research library, which currently contains almost 5,000 research articles on a variety of topics that are relevant for advocates. And I also help to create other resources such as our video explainer series and our fundamental series, which I'm going to talk a bit more about today. Faunalytics as an organization has existed since 2000. It was founded in the year 2000 by Che Green, and it was initially called the Humane Research Council. It was rebranded in 2014 to Faunalytics to better reflect the purpose of the organization and what our mission is. So our mission is to help advocates like you be more effective in your work and increase your impact. And we do that through two main programs. The first is our research library, which, as I mentioned, contains almost 5,000 research summaries to help you in your advocacy. And the second is through an original research program. Our research director, Dr. Joe Anderson, heads that up with the research team, and they conduct research on high impact areas for advocates. In 2017, we began to expand our programs a little bit to include more visual resources. We were getting a lot of feedback from the community that visual resources were something that people really wanted. And so in 2017, we created our first Faunalytics Fundamental. So Faunalytics Fundamentals are meant to be sort of broad topic overviews. We currently have 6. We have a fundamental on farmed animals, one on research animals, one on companion animals, one on wildlife, one on zoonoses, and one on ocean life. I'm also currently working on a Faunalytics Fundamental on animal and social justice, which is something that's near and dear to the hearts of all of us on the staff. So today, I wanted to talk to you about a couple of our fundamentals for the occasion of World Wildlife Day. Today is World Wildlife Day. World Wildlife Day was decreed in 2013 by the United Nations General Assembly, and the reason that it was put on this day is because this is the day that the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, which is also known as CITES, C-I-T-E-S, was signed in 1973. The purpose of World Wildlife Day is to celebrate and raise awareness of the world's wild animals and plants. And we know that a lot of animal advocates out there really care a lot about wildlife, wild animals, the suffering of wild animals, and conservation. So that's why we wanted to cover this. In case anyone is wondering, this year's theme for World Wildlife Day is recovering key species for ecosystem restoration. While we're not going to talk about that too specifically, it does link into a couple of the things that we'll mention. So I want to share my screen here and talk to you about our Faunalytics Fundamentals. As I said, these are resources that are highly visual and meant to provide a wide range of really reliable information in a very digestible sort of one-page format. Something that we heard from our users is that they really want sort of not necessarily a one-stop shop where they can find everything that they're looking for on a particular topic, but a broad overview that they can refer back to regularly and share with other people. So in 2019, we created the Wildlife Fundamentals, and I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see a little bit about it. And we're going to go through a couple of the fundamentals on that relate to wild animals so that you can see what they look like and what kind of info they contain. So I think you should be able to see my screen now. The first thing I wanted to talk to you about from the Wildlife Fundamentals is the global trade in wildlife. All kinds of species are traded, including both live and dead specimens. Live specimens are most often traded to keep as exotic companion animals, but also they're also used in research facilities and in zoos and aquaria. So I actually have some personal experience with this. Back when I was working on my film Maximum Tolerated Dose in 2011, 2012, I was involved in an investigation of the monkey trade for research labs. And my investigation was actually part of a submission to CITES back in 2014. So that's what live animals are used for. Dead animals are often taken to be traded as hunting trophies. Animal parts such as rhino horn or pangolin scales are used in some medicinal practices. Believe it or not, ivory is still an issue despite various bans around the world. It's important to note that the trade doesn't just affect a handful of charismatic species. A really wide-ranging study found that nearly 20% of all terrestrial vertebrates are affected by the global wildlife trade. That's 1 in 5 animals, vertebrate animals. The legal trade is estimated to be about $22 billion, and the illegal trade is about $20 billion. So one of the other things, and I'm going to scroll through so you can see some of our wonderful infographics. So one of the things that we advocates talk a lot about is how factory farming is affecting the climate. And of course, it's important to underline that climate change has a major impact on wild animals of all kinds. As temperatures change, animals go on the move. So animals change their habitat in terms of both elevation and latitude. What I mean by that is, let's say you're an animal species and you live at sea level. Well, if sea level becomes not as inhabitable as it used to be, you're going to seek areas of higher elevation to reach a point where you're in harmony with your environment and living well. In terms of latitude, let's say you're a migratory species and you're used to going, to northern latitudes in the summer. If the temperature at those latitudes changes, you may need to go more north or more south, depending on the kind of climate that you're looking for. This obviously has like a cascade of effects when animals change where they live. And when I say climate change is going to affect all wild animals, I really do mean all wild animals. It's estimated that about 40% of insect species are already at risk of extinction due to climate shifts. So, of course, when we talk about wild animals, it's pretty hard to talk about wild animals and what we humans do to them without talking about zoos and aquaria. Zoos are extremely popular. It's kind of shocking how popular they are. The Association of Zoos and Aquariums says that attendance at accredited zoos is greater than the annual attendance at Major League Baseball, National Hockey League, and National Football games combined. So that's mind-boggling in and of itself. But AZA accredited zoos only account for about 9% of zoos in the US. What's more, the AZA claims that zoos are vital for conservation, but they only spend about 1% of their revenue on conservation-related programs. Meanwhile, the reality of how much kids and adults actually learn at zoos is a whole other thing entirely. In 2 separate studies, one from the UK and one from the US, researchers found that visiting zoos resulted in mostly neutral or negative learning outcomes for kids, meaning that in some instances, children even came away from zoos learning knowing less than they did before. While for adults, it only marginally increases their knowledge of biodiversity and how they can protect it. So that's a bit of stuff that's contained in our wildlife fundamental. I want to move on to what's contained in our ocean life fundamental. So when it comes to our consumption of animals, fishes are consumed in by far the greatest numbers. So much so that if we place them on the same graph as other farmed animals, it would make our consumption of cows, pigs, and even chickens seem tiny, which of course it's not. Further complicating matters is the fact that fish catch is reported in live weight. So you'll often see that fish catch is reported in tons or in metric tons. They simply don't count individuals. That being said, some researchers have estimated that we kill trillions of fish a year. Unfortunately, it's not just the fishes that we consume directly who suffer for our appetites. There are two related issues that have an effect on the fishes that we don't eat. And those are bycatch and ghost fishing gear. So bycatch is essentially a term for fishes who are caught up in fishing nets who are not target species of the fishery in question. So to use a sort of popular example, if a boat is looking to catch tuna but happens to catch dolphins, the dolphins are considered bycatch. Ghost fishing gear is something that has gotten a lot more attention in the past decade or so. It essentially is discarded fishing gear. So let's say a fishing net gets damaged during trawling or something like that. In many instances, those nets will simply be thrown into the ocean. When they're there, they're no longer active in the sense that they're actively catching fish, but they still are able to entangle, trap, and kill fishes long after they've been used. Both of these things mean that there's a vast number of animals that suffer for our food who are not even consumed. It's estimated that bycatch accounts for nearly 10% of fishes taken from the ocean annually, which is shocking. And bycatch has a significant effect on endangered species as well, which you can see in the lower part of this infographic. So when we think about ocean life in captivity, we often think of the more charismatic ocean life species like orcas, dolphins, that sort of thing. I'll talk more about them in a second, but did you know that in terms of sheer numbers, fishes outnumber dogs and cats in terms of the number of companion animals in the US? They're also held in staggering numbers for research around the world. Unfortunately, in the US, statistics aren't kept on fishes. The reason for that is because fishes aren't protected under the Animal Welfare Act. However, we can sort of get an idea of, the scope of the use of fishes in research by looking at the UK. And in the UK, they do keep those numbers. So in the UK, fishes are actually the second most used animal in research after mice. Now, fortunately, there are research organizations that are looking to there are organizations that are looking to help ocean life, no matter how big or small. And I'm going to scroll down to show you a bit more about that. One of those organizations that I'd like to highlight is the Whale Sanctuary Project. So the Whale Sanctuary Project is going to be a site based in Port Hilford, Nova Scotia. And it's going to be a place where formerly captive whales who cannot be released into the wild because they're simply not, they wouldn't be able to adapt to living completely in the wild, will be able to live at this sanctuary. Now, one of the amazing things about this sanctuary is that it's going to be 100 times larger than the largest aquarium tank in the world. The largest aquarium tank in the world is about 1 acre, and the approximate bounds of the whale sanctuary site are going to be about 100 acres. Maybe the best part about this sanctuary, though, is that it's actually going to be what they call contiguous with the ocean. So it's going to be attached to the ocean. And that means that the whales who live there are going to be able to explore, swim, dive, and have an opportunity to thrive on their own terms. For formerly captive animals, it's going to be a place like no other. So finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about in this brief presentation is one of our resources that we created last year using a public data set. Essentially, we're going back to the global wildlife trade. It's a huge problem, and it's an issue that even has its own category in the Faunalytics Research Library. Last year, we conducted an analysis to examine United States wildlife product imports, and we wanted to focus specifically on the scope of the legal trade. The illegal trade is important, of course, and it rightfully gets a lot of attention. But we usually only get a picture of it through the data of what enforcement agencies are able to catch, and also what we know about the legal trade. So interestingly, we came across a data set from the Law Enforcement Management Information System, or LEMIS. And it was data that was collected by the US Fish and Wildlife Service and packaged by the EcoHealth Alliance. Basically, this was 15 years of data from 2000 to 2014. And then we also used some data after that to sort of fill in some blanks. Some of the most interesting findings that we came across were that the legal trade involved over 2 million separate shipments over those 15 years. And that comprised more than 60 biological classes. And over the course of those years, more than 3.2 billion live organisms were transported. 3.2 billion live organisms. So that's not counting, dead organisms and parts. To get a sense of what is 3.2 billion live organisms? Well, I went back and did some calculation, and that's actually the equivalent of how many cows that we eat over about a 10-year period, or cows that are slaughtered in a 10-year period around the world. Among other findings, we also found that refused shipments have stayed proportional at about 2%. So here you can see a graph of that. So this shows total shipments and then the percentage of shipments that were refused. What does it mean when a shipment is refused? Well, that can mean that it contains something illegal or otherwise was, contraband. And what does it mean that the percentage of refused shipments stays pretty proportionally low? Well, it can mean a lot of things, but probably the most obvious thing that it means is that enforcing laws around the wildlife trade are really tough, and that it's outside of the capabilities of any government or group of governments to really make a dent. Keeping in mind that we believe that the illegal wildlife trade is almost equal in value to the legal wildlife trade. The fact that the proportion of refused shipments stays around 2% is very telling. So those were the resources that I wanted to go over today. I also want to point out that you can go to faunalytics.org/category/wildlife to see to search through our library and see all of the study summaries that we have on wild animals. It's a great place to start if you're new to the issues or if you're a seasoned veteran advocate. So I'm going to open things up for Q&A. I really appreciate you all sticking around and letting me tell you about these things. While you drop a question into the chat, my colleague Jenna is going to gather those. While you drop those questions in there, I just want to mention that if you want to stay up to date on what Faunalytics does, the best way to do that is to sign up for our email alerts. We send weekly email alerts with fresh data and insights for advocates. And we also send out a monthly newsletter that gives you more information about what we've been up to and gives you, news about our upcoming studies and what we're working on. Speaking of those, We have a couple of studies coming out very soon that you'll want to keep an eye on. So I encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter to do so. I think Jenna is going to start sharing some questions for me. What is the biggest threat to wildlife that a lot of people might not be aware of? Thank you for this question. That's a good question. And this is going to sound strange because I just spent a whole bunch of time telling you about, telling you all kinds of things that I know about wildlife. But in many ways, I wouldn't consider myself a wild animal expert per se. I'm not a conservationist. I don't work in wild animal sciences or anything like that. I think that a lot of people do know that climate change is, has an effect on animals. But I think the biggest threat that people don't realize affects wild animals is factory farming. I think people understand that factory farming is maybe not good for the environment, but they really don't make the connection between factory farming, consuming meat, and animal products, and how those things have an effect on the world. So that is what I would say is life. Can I share examples of how our research is being used by wildlife advocates? That is a great question. And I'm not sure. That would be a great thing to do a follow-up blog on. It's one of the interesting things about running a website like ours. We get tens of thousands of page views a month. We get, last year, we were really fortunate to have over 600,000 page views throughout the year. And a lot of times people are using our resources in ways that we're not sure about. I will say, without revealing too much about any particular advocate, that we do get wild animal advocates who come to my office hours, for example, and ask for particular resources on different topics. So I think it really depends on the advocate, what area they're working in, and what we have that's useful for them. Lucas, thank you for tuning in. Lucas is one of our longtime volunteers and has written lots of study summaries for the Faunalytics library. The next fundamental is going to be on animal and social justice. So this is one that I'm working on that will be done by the end of March, and will likely launch at the first week of April or so. That fundamental is going to be looking at the ways that other forms of oppression overlap with animal advocacy. So, for example, I have been working on an infographic related to that, related to environmental racism, and looking at a case study of North Carolina where counties in North Carolina that have an extremely high concentration of pig and chicken farms are located in counties that have a disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and people of color, a population of people of color. Obviously, living close to factory farms is no picnic to begin with, but it's even more important because those things have health effects, and those health effects are externalized to traditionally marginalized populations. So that's one of the things that will make up the next Faunalytics fundamental. We're looking at migrant labor and vegetable farming, slave labor used in the fishing industry, and so on. Seems as though each state and province, I'm going to stop sharing. It seems as though each state and province in North America has their own rules and regulations about what is allowed or not allowed. With such a patchwork of legislation protecting exotic owned, what can advocates do to lobby for national federal change? That is a really good question, and you're absolutely right. There is an extreme patchwork of legislation. Certain states allow certain animals to be kept as exotic companions. Texas being an example of one that is, has achieved national prominence and infamy recently because of how many people keep wild tigers in essentially backyard zoos in Texas. It's very grim, and in fact, what one of the ways that the wild animal trade functions is that people will import animals into particular states where those animals might be allowed, and then trade them elsewhere. What can we do to change that? Well, as you said, lobbying at a state level, lobbying at a federal level would be great. I think there are organizations that are lobbying to sort of like get harmonized regulations across the board. Here in Canada, it's a similar patchwork, and those changes need to be made at the federal level as well. I think, unfortunately, because you can lobby at a state level as well, and that may be something that's more achievable, but I'm not sure what the vegan equivalent of whack-a-mole is, but it's like a game of whack-a-mole where regulations get tighter in one state, so people who are making money off this industry are going to move to another state or operate out of another state to make it happen. Yeah. How does Faunalytics decide on specific topics for research? Do you partner with organizations that want specific research done? So we do partner projects occasionally, but that's not the bulk of what we do. The bulk of what we do is actually we undertake a research prioritization process. So we start with a very broad range of topics, and through a process of board and staff level, and also through others from around the movement, we decide on research that's going to provide the best value for advocates, the most like actionable information, and information that's actually relevant to what advocates want to know. You can find out more research prioritization process on our website under the original research section. Do we know the status of the Jane Goodall Act? The bill was first introduced in 2015. So I'm not familiar with the Jane Goodall Act off the top of my head. So I can't comment on the status of it right at this moment, but it seems that it has to do with great apes in captivity. I also incidentally have some experience with this because connection at the Fauna Foundation, which is a chimpanzee sanctuary in Montreal. I can say that I have met chimpanzees in real life and had the opportunity to get to know them and actually even communicate with chimpanzees who can use sign language. And it is an incredible experience that I wish that everyone could have. Just really underlines why they shouldn't be in captivity. But unfortunately, I don't know about the Jane Goodall Act specifically. And I think that is all of the questions, and we're at half an hour. thank you so much to everyone who tuned in and for all of your questions. I hope I've answered them adequately. But feel free to stop by my office hours. So every Tuesday at noon Eastern, you can reach me at my office hours. In fact, there are a few of us on the team who do office hours. If you go to faunalytics.org/ask-us, you can find out more information about that. We do help all kinds of advocates and organizations pro bono. If you drop by our office hours, you can tell us the question you're looking to have answered, and we will do our best to answer it on the spot or to do some research and follow up with you. Again, check out faunalytics.org/ask-us for more information. And I think that's it. So on that note, thank you to all of you out there who are animal advocates working for Change for Animals. Thank you so much to my colleague Jenna for helping to facilitate this Facebook Live event and help me with fielding questions. And thanks to all of you for caring about animals and for connecting with Faunalytics. Until next time.